So last but not the least, we have Falaah from New York University. She'll talk about normative guidance from equal opportunity doctrines.
Thank you. Hello. This work is titled Towards Substantive Conceptions of Algorithmic Fairness, Normative Guidance from Equal Opportunity Doctrines, and it's joint work with Dr. Eleni Manis, who's a philosopher, and Dr. Julia Stoyanovich, who's a computer scientist. And essentially, the motivation here is to sort of translate between equal opportunities, or what I'll call EO for the rest of the talk, EO doctrines, the normative guidance that they encode with statistical measures of fairness, and see what that can tell us about the values that we're encoding in our systems. And so the motivation is three-pronged. One is almost universally, we all agree that fairness is not a mathematical or statistical concept. It's a moral or a philosophical one. We also entirely agree that fairness is context-specific. We also entirely agree that values are encoded in our algorithmic systems. But how do we unpack these dimensions in a way that's actually actionable? And so the reason we pick EO doctrines is the fact that if you link the nature of opportunity with the context of algorithmic decision making, we have a way to characterize context. And then maybe we can see which conceptions are more suitable for which applications. Um, so this work was essentially motivated by this fact paper by Haidari and co-authors. We were inspired by their work, but in formulating our own framework, we saw several conceptual limitations. The most important one being the fact that EO doctrines cannot be collapsed to a single decision point and cannot be posed as single criteria for substantive doctrines. And so any framework that comes from this framing is going to be essentially reductive. And so we will defer the rest of the criticism in the paper, but this is essentially the guiding principle for how our framework is set up. So to set the context for what we talk about, we're going to try to port influential doctrines from equal opportunity to algorithmic contexts. This is fundamentally hard because philosophers love jargon and love leaving the specifics out, right? And as computer scientists, we have to put the specifics back in. And so in areas where we don't have enough guidance, we provide modern reinterpretations. One thing that's extremely helpful is a framing in terms of principles and a temporal dimension. The principles come from philosophy. Interestingly enough, the temporal dimensions were not something that philosophers themselves explicitly mentioned. This is one of the contributions of our work, and hopefully it'll be intuitive to you why we see it this way. We'll then use this to motivate a moral interpretation of the impossibility results, because if we cannot reconcile trade-offs between fairness measures statistically, we sort of need to do it normatively. And so let's get started. What is equal opportunity? Equal opportunity essentially is a doctrine in political philosophy that objects to any morally irrelevant factor affecting the distribution of opportunity or the access to desirable positions. And so looking at the principles that help us set up that y-axis, so there are two broad principles. The first is the principle of fair contests, which is understood as non-discrimination in machine learning. This is fairly well understood. And so the principle of fair contest essentially says that positions should be open to all, and nobody should be disallowed from running a fair contest on the basis of a morally irrelevant characteristic. The second principle is the principle of fair life chances, which looks more broadly. So this is not just one specific decision point. This says over the course of my lifetime, are my irrelevant characteristics like my gender, my race, my disability, my socioeconomic status affecting my access to opportunity? And already we can see three broad scopes emerging. So the first domain of EO is fairness at a specific decision point. And this is almost entirely the focus of fair machine learning. There are two other domains, however. One is the equality and developmental opportunities, which are those squiggly lines on top. So essentially, these are opportunities that made you build up your qualifications in the first place to actually run this contest. And that's somewhat overlooked in fair machine learning. The third domain is opportunities over the course of a lifetime. We know by prominent studies now that fairness at one specific decision point is just not enough. And so maybe we have to look at opportunity sets that people have that they have access to over the course of a lifetime, and actually see whether these bundles are then comparable. So with this in mind, you can sort of pick a principle and then find a corresponding doctrine. There's an incredible number of doctrines, so we limit our discussion to these four. And so let's get into it. So the first is formal EO. And so formal EO essentially is understood as careers open to talents, which is exactly the principle of fair contest, which says anybody who wants to compete for a desirable position should be allowed to compete, and the contest should only be adjudicated on the basis of relevant merit. And so this came from an influential thought experiment about the warrior society proposed by Bernard Williams back in 1973, which says, so formal EO emerged as a challenge to the aristocratic practice of distributing positions based on like natural like inheritance essentially. So what we're trying to do here in formal EO, if you port this to our context, we don't live in a warrior society, but we live in a big test society. So tests, essentially everybody's allowed to write the test, but the outcomes of the test determine the access to opportunities that you have at the next point in time. So let's look at what measures sort of encode this moral desiderata of formal EO. And if you look at the statistical criterion of calibration, right? So calibration essentially says that if two people have the same predicted score, which is S equal to C, and they only differ on the basis of their irrelevant characteristic, which is here A, which could be gender, race, disability, then we expect them to have the same outcome. And this is exactly what formal EO has been saying since 1973. And so very clearly, there's a mapping between the moral desiderata of formal EO and the statistical measure of measures that use calibration. Next, we look at formal plus EO. So essentially, if we look at what formal EO is saying, it's making a promise about the fact that the test measures relevant merit, because that's what we're using to distribute outcomes. What if it didn't? So here's a real world example. The SAT is an indication of college potential, but it's also an inflated indication of test prep and access to resources to write the test or to write the test multiple times, right? And so what if the validity of the test tracks irrelevant group membership? And this is an extremely new doctrine, so it's 2014. It's a modern look at EO. And so this exactly aligns, as you might already be thinking about, with measures that try to balance error rates. So again, just thinking about what I told you about formal plus, a measure that tries to equalize false positive and false negative rates across groups satisfies the moral criteria of formal plus EO. So for those of you all who are familiar with the impossibility results, maybe this is already making sense to you in your head. But now let's look at, just from these two doctrines, what we can say about our mathematical impossibility. So this is the mathematical statement, which is absent of a perfect classifier, which is the fact that we don't live in an ideal world. It's impossible to simultaneously achieve calibration and error rate balance across groups if the base rates or prevalence across groups differs. So let's put back on our philosophy hats and unpack this a little bit. So let's look at what calibration was saying. Calibration, so formal EO as calibration essentially is framing an endpoint view, a backward facing view of a fair contest. Let's see why. So S equal to C is a predicted score. We compute the predicted score based on qualifications that people have built up to this point of competition. And we're conditioning on that and on the irrelevant characteristic. So this is essentially rewarding past qualifications that people have built up. Let's look at what formal plus EO is doing. So formal plus EO as error rate balance is now conditioning on the true label. So for example, if you're doing college admissions, the true label is indicative of, let's say, college potential. This is how the person would perform at the job on offer, not the job in the past, right? And so intuitively, you can also just look at the measure if you stare at them enough. That's how this paper came about. But so you can see the fact that formal plus EO essentially is a forward-facing view of a fair contest, and it's a starting point view. My fair contest is not over. I'm setting the person up for the next fair contest. And I would encourage you to either read this paper or read the impossibility papers, because it's incredible about the fact that even while discussing these measures in the Kleinberg et al. Paper, they make references to like future performance and past performance, but obviously they didn't know EO. So we snuck in and wrote this paper. But essentially all of this is like prescient in the original paper itself. So, okay, let's put this back together. So now we have two opposing conceptions of a fair contest, but the last piece of the puzzle in our impossibility result was the notion of base rates or prevalence. So base rates essentially is the proportion of the population that gets a positive outcome, or in EO speak, the proportion of the population that has a qualification that leads to a positive outcome, right? And so in a world where people have fair life chances, so fair life chances is a broad concept. I will not say, it'll be wrong to say that we can actually measure it at one decision point. But if we are to approximate it, if I'm to aggregate overall irrelevant factors, the base rates in an outcome seem to be a reasonable approximation of people's fair life chances. Because if, let's say, men and women had equal life chances, we would probably have comparable base rates. And so really putting this together now, what you would think we would get is that fair contests and fair life chances oppose each other. But what we actually notice now is the fact that two different conceptions of a fair contest trade off against each other when people don't have fair life chances. And so now, if you go back and think about what I told you about fair life chances, this means we need to start maybe modeling for life chances as opposed to modeling for different conceptions of a fair contest at discrete decision points. And so this motivates the second half of the paper, which is how to design substantive EO. So moving towards substantive EO, I'm going to skip the limitations, but really, okay, maybe one thing that could help motivate the need for substantive EO is more about the fact that, so in the warrior society, the warrior test overestimated the qualifications of kids of warrior parents. But it's also true that kids of warrior parents will actually grow up to be more likely to be good warriors. And so that's why you need substantive EO, because it's not enough to measure merit. You also have to go back and recorrect the fact that people have unequal access to opportunity. Okay, so we'll start. So what we do now is we'll do like a classic version of the doctrine, hopefully identify limitations, and then tell you our modern reinterpretation. So we'll start with Rawls. Um, Rawls's principle of fair equality of opportunity is sandwiched in his broader doctrine of justice. And Rawls identifies two mechanisms that lead to inequality, which are arbitrary. So they're the natural lottery and the social lottery. So the natural lottery distributes your native talent to you. The social lottery distributes your initial starting position in the social system. And Rawls posits in a 200-page book about the fact that it's not these arbitrary mechanisms that are unfair. It's how institutions act on these arbitrary distributions that cause inequality. And so his entire doctrine is like this iterative regulatory approach to redistribute inequality such that we bring about fair equality of opportunity. And so that's why we represent it as a bouncy castle. But so the limitation with Rawls, which is a huge limitation, is the fact that he's an ideal theorist. So his entire 200-page book is about why people in a justice respecting society will choose his principles. We have no guidance about how to bring about those principles, or even like a clear direction of what those principles mean. So this is verbatim the principle of fair equality of opportunity, which is the fact that equally talented people must have equal prospects of success. What does that mean to a computer scientist, right? And so at this point, maybe one thing to just like guide where we'll go with this is the fact that if Rawls could peer into the mind of a child, which is what we're showing here, and could somehow measure native talent, then he would regulate social institutions such that over the course of their lifetime, they would all have the same prospects of succeeding. So we'll try to unpack this more in a second, but that's the general idea. And as you can see, there's a lot left to unpack here. But before that, we'll then look at a classic version of Luck egalitarian EO. So Luck egalitarian EO frames a different version of arbitrary mechanisms, which is brute luck versus choice luck. So brute luck is anything that happened to you that you did not choose for yourself, and choice luck are your responsible choices. And the Luck egalitarian posits that it's not ability that we should measure or that we should use to distribute outcomes, because because there is the effect of brute luck on ability. So instead, we should measure something like effort. So how much effort is somebody putting into getting a position? And so there needs to be some way to sort of remove the effect of brute luck and only distribute on the basis of choice luck. Again, what does that even mean? It sort of means like we need a sorting hat to tell us what people want and at which point did brute luck stop affecting them and choice luck start affecting them. But it's inherently unclear. So we have a version of Luck egalitarian EO from Romer, who's an economist. And so this is a lot more operational. And so the idea here essentially is that we can't measure and we can't even hypothesize what all is brute luck, but we do know in our society which factors affect people's access to opportunity. So we'll call these circumstances. And it's unfair or it's unjust to compare people with different circumstances against each other. The intuition here is that people's effort or people's ability is not a function of their individual native talent, it's a function of their circumstance. And so in order to make any sort of assertion about who's more talented, we need to condition out this circumstance. And so what you're seeing here is the fact that Roma suggests constructing types based on circumstance. And so you have a distribution for each type conditioned on that person's effort. And so people who are at the same percentile of their individual type distributions are now comparable. So that's a version of EO of Luck egalitarian EO that maybe we could work with. So the problems with both these doctrines, with Rawls, hopefully it's clear at this point, which is there's not much guidance. With luck egalitarian EO, sure, we can construct types, and then we can get the highest scoring apples and the highest scoring oranges and the highest scoring bananas. But which fruit do we want if we only get to pick one, right? And so we have apples and oranges problems with Romer. And the moment we start looking at stuff like intersectional groups or intersectional definitions of circumstance, then the problem immediately becomes intractable. So in line with sort of the temporal dimension that we sort of uncovered or we introduced into formal doctrines, we will reinterpret substantive doctrines using like a temporal dimension. So I'm going to let you stare at the picture for a second while I drink water. Okay. So let's look at what the luck egalitarian was saying. The luck egalitarian was saying remove the effect of brute luck. So brute luck is stuff that's already happened to you. So it seems like a backward facing view of life chances would mean conduct a fair contest after you've counterfactually equalized people's life chances. So even this whole notion of conditioning out circumstance is first equalizing life chances and then conducting a fair contest. And so we interpret this as like a backward facing view of life chances because you're only adjusting it up until this point. So the differential effort that actually led to difference in ability will still continue after this timestamp, but you're only correcting for it in the past. You're not going to correct for it in the future. Whereas Rawls, intuitively as well, if you remember that statement about equally talented people should have equal prospects of success, is an inherently forward-facing view. So essentially what this says is that peek ahead, because and remember, Rawls's formulation is for the entire system, the system that distributes opportunities again and again. So it's almost like saying peek forward and see what allocation I have to make at time t so that people's life chances are more comparable at time t plus 1. And so this is inherently a forward-facing view. So putting all of this together, hopefully now we're able to do some of the things we set out to do. So we were trying to sort of characterize context. And by looking at the nature of opportunity being distributed, maybe we can characterize context. So one example is the fact that, let's say we're distributing a grant, right? This is clearly a reward for past performance. So maybe a backward-facing view of a fair contest is sufficient. But let's say we're doing school admissions, which I love that I'm following your paper because it was the best setup. So let's say we're doing that, right? That's an important developmental opportunity. So maybe we want to forego utility at this timestamp for equity tomorrow. And so by making this connection between the nature of opportunity and the context of algorithmic decision making, we can actually then pick fairness criteria that are context specific. So another cool thing that maybe hopefully this kind of work will trigger is the fact that we're saying machine learning systems encode values, and people inherently like just implicitly encode values, but there's no way to actually go back and say what their value was or why it's correct or bad, or even just debate in norms, right? But maybe this is a first step. So now we know which family of measures align with what kind of normative considerations in terms of, are you designing a contest, are you looking at life chances, are you doing backwards, are you doing forwards? And so maybe now we can, I'm not saying we're done, but this is like a necessary first step. So now when we say you're not being explicit about your norms, people could have been like, but how am I supposed to? Now maybe you can. So now we can actually connect normative judgments with statistical measures. I'll conclude just on a summary of everything that we contributed. But the one thing that I really want to point out is the fact that it almost seems like a lot of our contribution is on the forward-facing front, because like this version of Rawls doesn't exist in the world or didn't exist in the world, and neither was formal plus EO. It wasn't a part of EO taxonomies in fair machine learning. So it almost feels like what we've been inherently doing is designing for the past. But if you think about like systems that have made the news, like Compass, right? We're using it for recidivism. We're using it to predict criminal offense in the future. And so it's not sufficient to design backward-facing mechanisms anymore, neither at an individual decision point nor over the course of a lifetime. I will stop there because I want to take questions. Thank you for your time and your attention. Yeah.
Questions for our speaker?
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask about, in terms of applications, you very clearly stated how this can inform the choice of metrics. Are there any applications where you might see an intersection between fair contest and fair life chances, or are these like two distinct categories?
That's a great question. So Right. So if you actually even think about the way we've set up fair life chances, there's a notion of a fair contest in it anyway. Because I mean, decision making comes with allocating something, right? And so we're always going to be designing for a contest. The question is whether we're only thinking about a contest or we're thinking about life chances. So any application of this, so in the paper, for example, we have two examples of how to apply this. One is from like an auditor's perspective in terms of which metric to choose to even audit these systems, because if they mathematically trade off, then the company that created the system can be like, it satisfies this, so it's fair, which North Point did, right? That's one example. The other example is how to apply this to college admissions. And so we give you 4 procedures based on each of the 4 approaches, but inherently there will always be a fair contest that you're designing. It just depends on whether you're looking broader or not, or only at the fair contest, right? Because that's where we as algorithmic like designers even just come in, right? Nobody's just building systems to not do anything. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. Thanks. This was a great talk. I'm very sympathetic to the perspective in this paper. I look forward to reading it. And what I take to be part of the gist of it, which is that issues like fairness and equity are really at heart dynamic problems. They are not static problems, or rather it is artificial to approach them as static problems. And I kind of wanted to push you a little bit on the point about how these differences in temporality in these approaches to fairness, for example, intersect with different theories of politics, or like substantive conceptions of like the politics of social order. So for example, if you think of like Rawls and Romer, one is a liberal and one is a Marxist, basically, right? And there are lots of implications of that. But I'm just curious to hear a little bit more briefly about how you see these temporal dimensions you're unpacking here interfacing with like substantive organizational questions about how a polity should operate, or how it might operate in accordance with a sense of peoplehood, a sense of citizenship.
Thank you for that question. That was a great question. It almost wants me to like, so I'm not a philosopher, but I got obsessed with this. It makes me want to go read more like politics now. But so my answer to this question is that's not what we're trying to do. So we're never saying this is the right way to do. We're saying this is a normative, like this is the value judgment that comes baked into the system, and you pick what your value judgment is. So we're never going to be like, this is the right thing to do, because that's not an algorithmic question. That's not a question that an algorithm should answer or can answer ever, right? And so even if we would think more deeply about that, it would always come down to mapping different different conceptions of what's important to the organization politically and, let's say, economically. But I don't think that's a fundamentally underspecified question, right? And if we go out there to answer it in one way, then we're just opening ourselves up to like problems, because there is no one answer. Thank you for that question.
So let's. Oh, sorry.
That was a great talk, and really enjoyed your illustrations too.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to focus on Rawls's theory of justice as opposed to any other advancements and critiques that have come after that, and especially as it relates to equal opportunity? Because some critiques of Rawls's work have also focused on like his, I guess people have critiqued it for being like a racialized view of justice and like the principles that he's building upon.
That is a great question. And like there are whole lines of work about the fact that you can't even port Rawls to a system where race is a part of irrelevant features. Absolutely given, right? So maybe I'll answer this by going back to like the motivation. So essentially when the when the Haidari paper came out, that was like the definitive guide on what EO is in an algorithmic context. And so in that paper, they look at, okay. Right. So this paper at the bottom. So therefore, doctrines are libertarian EO, formal EO, like egalitarian EO, and Rawls. Libertarianism is not even a form of equal opportunity, right? And so we started from there, and so we were really trying to understand from like if like a philosopher had written that paper, or like would do like a check, what would we find? And so we started from there. So we immediately went to Rawls. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think. It's not the most operational doctrines that become popular. So maybe there is something to discover here, but we started from there, so we were limited there, and we only like came up and like discovered formal plus because it's a version of formal. But that's also why formal plus isn't very well understood either. That would be really cool to go back and look at stuff that's not as popular, academically popular, but that's still influential. Yeah. Thank you for that question.